Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. A chemical tanker ship was attacked by Somali pirates in the Gulf of Aden on Sunday. The USS Mason, along with other U.S. Navy ships that are part of a counter-piracy task force, responded to this hijacking. Seeing the U.S. Navy bearing down on them, the Somali pirates fled the tanker in a small boat that they had used to carry out the attack. The USS Mason gave chase. While this task force was conducting their operation, 2 ballistic missiles were allegedly fired in the general area where this hijacking had taken place. And when I say general area, I mean very general. The alleged ballistic missiles landed 10 miles away from the USS Mason. 2 missiles, and they both landed 10 miles away. The Mason wasn't damaged. Obviously, none of its crew was harmed. I do find it interesting that the white media makes sure to describe the missiles as being ballistic. For those of you who don't know, all ballistic means is that the missile is not powered throughout the entirety of its flight. It's only powered for when it takes off. Unlike a cruise missile, which has a rocket engine that's on and powers it through its entire flight, a ballistic missile is only powered until it reaches its trajectory, and from there it falls to its target. But people hear the word ballistic and they immediately think nuclear ballistic missile, which I can't help but think is what people were supposed to misconceive. These ballistic missiles didn't have nuclear warheads, but what about next time? For the record, the white media has been hyping this, but even the White House knows that there's no real substance here. They had to admit that the so-called attack doesn't seem at all related to the war in Israel. Now, why would they say that? It's because the missiles were allegedly fired from Yemen, in an area controlled by a group known as the Houthi rebels. Now, the Houthi are an insurgency fighting against the Yemeni government, and they allegedly want to take control of the country. I say allegedly because all this is coming to us through the white media, so you know how reliable they are. The government of Saudi Arabia has been fighting against the Houthi in Yemen. Why? Because the Saudis are Sunni Muslims, and the Houthis are Shiite Muslims, just like the Muslims in Iran. In fact, the government of Iran has been supporting the Houthis. So this conflict in Yemen is basically seen by the West as being a proxy war by Iran, and that the Houthis are going to help Iran to spread their influence in the region. That's why the white media and the government making a claim that someone launched 2 missiles at a U.S. warship from Houthi-controlled territory is no small thing. You've had white think tanks like the Brookings Institute talking for over half a decade about how the U.S. is at war with the Houthis. I didn't know that, did you? These think tanks are organizations whose job it is to influence American policy by putting together reports and such that are written by alleged academics. That way their talking points will sound studious and very smart and learned. So while the Houthis haven't been on our radar, they've certainly been on the radars of certain interested parties. Now, I posted some quick thoughts about this alleged attack in the Gulf of Aden on Twitter, but I still feel compelled to make this a morning briefing. I guess the theme for this week is about maintaining our doubts about what the white media tells us. Now, when I heard about this incident and saw the way that the white media was framing it, I got a strong sense of déjà vu. You see, the story of a U.S. warship being attacked in a foreign gulf in the Eastern Hemisphere, where the details are sketchy, but we're told the attack came from forces hostile to the U.S., and these forces controlled territory nearby. We've heard this story before. In Vietnam. In early 1964, the U.S. was not involved in the fighting taking place between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. The U.S. had, up until that point, been giving aid and advice to the South Vietnamese, which means weapons and training, just like the U.S. had been doing with Ukraine until recently. However, that would all change on August 2, 1964, at about 2:40 p.m., when a Navy destroyer, the USS Maddox, was on patrol in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Tonkin Gulf is a body of water just off the coast of Vietnam. Now, according to the U.S. Naval Institute, 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats approached the Maddox, but didn't attack. The captain of the Maddox, however, ordered his men to open fire if they came closer than 10,000 yards. Allegedly, this happened, and the captain fired a shot across the bow of the closest North Vietnamese patrol boat. The Vietnamese responded by launching torpedoes and opening fire. The torpedoes were reportedly destroyed by the Maddox, who allegedly returned fire and heavily damaged one of the patrol boats. The North Vietnamese vessels reportedly left the area. Weather conditions that day were clear and the seas were calm. It was daylight, so they could see what was happening. The U.S. Naval Institute boldly claims that there is no doubting the fact that there was an attack on August 2nd. Keep in mind, by their own admission, it was the U.S. captain of the Maddox who actually did the attacking, but Anyway, 2 days later, there was a second incident, again involving the Maddox and another vessel, the Turner Joy. This time, conditions were anything but clear. Whereas the August 2nd incident happened in broad daylight under clear conditions, the August 4th incident happened in the middle of the night in a storm, and waves were as high as 6 feet, so it was low visibility. They claimed to be tracking unidentified vessels, but they never actually saw any Vietnamese at all. They would acquire, lose, and then reacquire targets seemingly at random. Both of the U.S. vessels in the area reported spotting torpedoes in the water, enemy searchlights, and having had numerous radar and surface contacts. The ships responded by firing their guns, shells, and depth charges. A U.S. fighter plane had taken off to give the destroyers air support, but the pilot reported not having seen anything. As the pilot put it, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats there. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." This went on for 3 hours. And although nobody actually saw anything, and there were no enemy vessels spotted, destroyed, or anything else, that didn't stop the word from getting back to D.C. The Joint Chiefs of Staff became involved, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, and even the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. McNamara didn't have any proof that an attack had occurred, other than the alleged gut feeling of the Pacific Fleet commander. But McNamara told President Johnson the incident had happened, and President Johnson eagerly went on TV and told the country that the North Vietnamese had attacked 2 U.S. vessels and he intended to retaliate. A few days later, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president authority to conduct military operations, even though Congress had not officially declared war. And of course, this would set the pattern for every war the U.S. has conducted ever since. All right. Now that you know how the Gulf of Tonkin incident directly led to the Vietnam War, I hope you also understand how it's eerily similar to this recent incident in the Gulf of Aden. An enemy vessel reportedly carries out an attack, but the U.S. vessel's not damaged, no one's harmed. However, the attack is carried out by an enemy trying to spread their influence in the region, and that makes this so provocative that action has to be taken. But here's something else you should know. I told you how Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He would go on to remain the Defense Secretary for much of the war, at least until Johnson left office in '68. He was the one most responsible for telling the president that the August 4th incident had actually happened. But 31 years later, on November 9th, 1995, Robert McNamara went to Hanoi, that's the capital of Vietnam, and he met with General Vo Nguyen Giap. General Giap was the North Vietnamese chief strategist during the war. Now, during this meeting in 1995, McNamara was smiling like a Cheshire cat. As giddy and jolly as he was acting, you would never have known that there had been a war between himself and the man that he was talking to. McNamara was acting like they were old friends. And then, in the middle of the meeting, McNamara says this.
To this day, I don't know what happened on August 2nd and August 4th, 1964 in the Tonkin Gulf.
You get that? To this day, I don't know what happened on August 2nd and August 4th of 1964 in the Tonkin Gulf. 30-plus years after McNamara had assured the president and the nation that an incident had occurred, and here he was sitting there saying he still didn't know what had happened. This is the guy who was the Secretary of Defense. And he didn't say that he used to know, but now he's unsure. He said he still didn't know, which meant that he didn't know what had happened on August 4th while he was assuring the president that he did. So the Vietnam War was predicated on a lie. This wasn't some fog of war stuff. This was powerful men in Washington who knew that nobody would ever drag them into The Hague, no matter what they did, and there would never be any prosecutions on U.S. soil either. This clip isn't viewed very often. Kind of like the one where W admitted that there was no evidence that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, even though he had been misleading the country into believing that Saddam Hussein was. To this day, there's still Americans who believe that there had been an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 4th. This is because there's an enormous propaganda organ, the white media, who does not inform the public when the government's lied to them. But as the black media, it's our responsibility to make sure our people know. Because when they think up some war that they want to get into so they can take somebody else's resources, it's going to be black men who are disproportionately killed. You think you're joining the army to get the GI Bill to pay for college, but before you know it, you're overseas dodging bullets based on a lie. So that's why we need to drill down on this little incident. The U.S. has been trying to find a way to go to war with Iran for at least the last 20 years.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Now, if you were paying attention to the list that General Clark gave, you know that the U.S. has already run through a number of countries on that list, and Iran is at the end of it. The recent war in Israel has actually added fuel to that fire. It certainly impressed upon the U.S. government that it might be better to try to do something in Iran sooner rather than later. Biden has plenty of incentive. His poll numbers are in the toilet. He knows it. So I wouldn't put it past him to start a war just to try to boost his plummeting approval ratings. This is pretty standard for U.S. presidents. Foreign wars are always good for taking people's minds off of problems at home, and Lord knows Biden's got problems at home. But we can't afford to be blind to these things. Letting these incidents fall down the memory hole is lethal, especially to an oppressed people. They would love to try to sneak up on us, and if we're not careful, this country will wind up sleepwalking into yet another Vietnam War, as if Afghanistan and Iraq weren't bad enough. And just like with McNamara, after thousands of black soldiers come back in body bags, or come back crippled and maimed, or just don't come back at all, I'm sure we'll see some of the same people who lied us into the war in Iran smiling, shaking hands with whatever puppet leader they put in charge of Iran, and casually saying they weren't very sure what caused that war either. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Maurice Rigaud, Morris Bodden, Pamela Hyman, Mark Stroud, and Chris MC. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.